God's judgment strikes fear and dread. Every religion thunders its day of reckoning. None of them nice. We've all behaved in ways untoward, and settling ultimate accounts forebodes no joy. But to me, because God's judgment is core of God's plan, to examine God's judgment is to assess God's existence. If the God of mercy contradicts the God of judgment, then perhaps the whole God concept is incoherent. If God does not exist, God's judgment may be evidence to expose it. If God does exist, and assuming God is merciful as well as just, maybe we've missed the meaning of God's judgment. I am Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my journey to find out.
We've got here Joseph Butler's Analogy of Religion.
I start in Oxford with a leading Christian philosopher, Richard Swinburne. Richard is renowned for upholding traditional doctrines of God and Christianity with rigorous analysis. Richard, one of the characteristics of many religions is at our death or after our death, there is some sort of judgment. Do you believe in such a judgment?
I believe that after our death, God judges us. I think we have to answer for the life we have been given to our Creator, who has made this gift to us. Our Creator will judge us on the basis of what we have made of that life.
Well, one of the arguments against particularly Christianity is the existence of hell, where some, maybe not many, will be consigned to an everlasting punishment for what is certainly a very finite number of decades.
Yes.
Is this the act of an all-good God?
I don't think it's best regarded as a punishment. If I can take you back a stage or two, in our life all the time we have to choose between doing good and doing evil. And it's a characteristic of human beings that each time we do a good act, it's easier to do a good act next time. Each time we do a bad act, it's easier to do a bad act next time. So gradually people form their character over life. Everybody can observe this psychologically. People's characters get harder and harder. Clearly what God hopes is that we will become more naturally good people. But of course it's possible that every time somebody chooses, or most of the time somebody chooses, they choose the bad. Now, choosing the bad is not quite symmetrical to choosing the good, because the good motivates. That's to say, if you recognize something as good, then that leads you to do it. But if you refuse to do it each time, you don't deliberately choose the bad, you yield to the bad inclinations. And as you yield more and more to the bad inclinations, so you become more and more insensitive to the good. So what would a good God do with somebody who had totally annihilated his sensitivity to the moral? Well, he could impose a sensitivity on them, but that would mean that they are not being allowed a choice of forming their own character. If God imposed a character on him, then God would be saying to all of us, whatever you choose, in the end it's not going to make any difference because I'm going to make you a certain sort of person. And that is not giving us the ultimate freedom of what we are to be. What is central to the doctrine of Christianity and some other religions is that in our life we often have ultimate choices of the sort of person we are to be, which affects our eternal destiny.
You must assume that it is a permanent and irrevocably so.
Well, it will be so if he has annihilated his sensitivity to the good. If he hasn't altogether done that, then of course I don't want to say that he is permanently barred from God.
It may be that people who have done the absolute worst things have thought in their mind, however distorted, that they were actually having to do some bad in order for some greater good.
Well, if he really thought that, then in that case he's not made himself irrevocably bad.
There are many other categories. We have babies who were born for a day and then die. We have billions of people who existed without knowledge of good or evil. We've had people who are mentally deficient. I mean, there's many different kinds of categories other than people who have been good and people who are irrevocably
That is true, and certainly as far as Christianity is concerned, it is not a doctrine of the Church that anybody is in hell. It's all the doctrine is that there is this possibility for you. Maybe nobody avails themselves of this possibility, but it exists, and it's something we should fight against.
To Richard, what we do in this life sets our character for all eternity. God will not impose righteousness on us. The choice is ours, so are the consequences. But eternal punishment for finite sin troubles me. I should get another view. Judgment is so important in characterizing God. I go to Cambridge to meet John Polkinghorne, a physicist turned Anglican priest. Might John's science influence his ideas of judgment? If I'm to take seriously a theistic hypothesis, I have to deal with things that are part of it: judgment, heaven, hell, things that are criticized by many modern philosophers or ordinary people. How do you deal with those subjects?
Let me say, first of all, that I believe that God's love and mercy is not time limited, that when we die, a curtain doesn't come down. If we're caught on the wrong side of that curtain, God says, too bad, you had your chance, now off with you. I think that God's offer of love and mercy will always be there, but I also think that the decisions and actions that we take in this life will shape our characters, and if we turn away from God, particularly if we do so consciously in this life, that is spiritually damaging, or will make it more difficult to respond to God's offer of mercy and love beyond. And judgment, I think, is not appearing before a testy celestial judge who is anxious to throw you into prison and torture as quickly as possible. It is an encounter with reality. Judgment is seeing ourselves as we really are. And that will be a painful experience for us, because we shall find all sorts of dross and misshapenness in our lives. And we'll have to come to terms with that and allow God to reshape us in ways that are true fulfillment. That's what judgment is. It is an encounter with reality, not a sentence of punishment. So ultimately, I believe judgment is a hopeful word. And the process of judgment is something that we should not seek to avoid, but we should ultimately welcome.
But this is a temporal process as opposed to a specific instant?
I think it will be a process, yes. I think that's right, because I think that's how God works. They're not in a blinding flash of illumination. I think that nobody will be turned away from the kingdom of heaven who wishes to enter it. But equally, I think nobody will be carried kicking and screaming into the divine presence against their will. And there may be people who will resist God's offer of mercy and love forever. And if there are such people, then they are the people who are in hell. And the tragedy of hell is that they're there by their choice. The doors of hell, as the preachers say, are locked on the inside to keep the life of God out, rather than on the outside to keep the sinners in there. That's my picture of hell. My picture of heaven is the unending exploration of the inexhaustible riches of the divine nature unveiled before us. And if finite human beings are really to come to know the infinite reality of God, that's going to be an unending step-by-step process. So the life of heaven isn't going to be boring. It isn't going to be just sitting on a cloud strumming a harp and shouting out hallelujahs and things like that. It's going to be this deeply fulfilling and unending exploration of divine richness.
John is blunt. Judgment is a vital part of God's plan and must not be brushed aside. Moreover, judgment should be welcomed, not feared. Departing from tradition, John asserts that judgment is a process, not a sentence, and it proceeds beyond death. If a judgment there'd be, that'd be a judgment I'd like. But to explore God's judgment, I cannot ignore Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. For God's judgment in Islam, I go to Washington, D.C. to meet Seyyed Nasr, a distinguished Islamic philosopher who appreciates ultimate things. Hussein, in Islamic philosophy, let's start with judgment. What happens?
First of all, we have to have a posthumous existence in order to be judged. And judgment by God in Islamic thought involves, first of all, a life in this world. God judges what we do, and this Islam shares with Judaism and Christianity, and especially the Jewish tradition. However, according to Islam, man has a posthumous reality. That is, man's soul does not die with physical death. What defines us as us survives our physical existence in this world. And what we take with us into the other world is the fruit of our actions, because our actions affect how we exist. But the question of judgment by God is always combined with the aspect of mercy. We cannot predetermine God's judgment. There are self-righteous people in all religions who try to do that. But that is really an insult to God. And the Quran is very, very strong on that.
What is the nature of hell in the Islamic tradition?
Symbolically, hell in Islam is not that different from what we find in Judaism and Christianity. First of all, the torment of fire. Hell is always identified with fire. But the highest pain, which Islam emphasizes, like Dante did in the Divine Comedy, is separation from God. Hell is separation from God, because in this world we do not see the beauty of God. So we don't care whether we're separated or not.
Is there a possibility in Islamic philosophy in post-mortem to make progress, or is death a final judgment?
For Kalam, or Islamic theology, posthumous states of transformation, which would already correspond to purgatory, do not play a role. But in later Islamic philosophy, they play a very important role. That is, we have a journey after death as we had in this life. It's not that black and white. In fact, there's a possibility of transformation after death. But the gist of it is that our development, you might say, in the deepest sense of the term, does not stop with death. Something stops, but the soul continues to develop and to become.
Post-mortem existence of the soul, a God of mercy and justice. Though colored by culture, the Islamic judgment is similar to the Christian judgment. For judgment in Hinduism, I ask V.V. Raman, a Hindu physicist who seeks integration between science and religion.
The notion of judgment is part of the idea of the law of karma. In the Hindu world, we reap the consequences of our actions. And it is not as if there is someone sitting there passing judgment on what you have done, but it is simply a natural consequence in the moral framework of what you have done, both the good and the bad. So conceptually, Hindus don't believe in a judgment day. It is a perennial thing that is happening. So the notion here in the context of Judgment Day is not something that we dread, but it is something that we go through the consequences of our action. But ultimately, it is a positive thing. Somebody once said that the pessimist may be right in the long run, but it is the optimist who has fun all along the way. Now, the Hindu view is somewhat the opposite. maybe the pessimist is right in terms of the horrible things happening here, but ultimately it is the optimist who is right, because ultimately we are all going to be one with the cosmic whole. We will not be thrown into a dungeon for life just because we don't believe in this God or that.
And does that mean everybody? In the Hindu tradition, does everybody ultimately make it?
Yes, absolutely. And that includes, between you and me, even Christians. And I'm saying this because occasionally we have heard it said that non-believers, non-Christians, will go elsewhere. I don't want to use bad words here, but not to the heaven. Some years ago, I went to a church on Christmas Day, and it was said, "Let us rejoice in the Lord's birth, all are welcome." And then the next day I went to a temple in India, and it said, "Non-Hindus not allowed." I think it has changed now, but it shocked me. And then I said, look at the difference. Christianity allows everybody to come into the church. Hinduism does not allow everybody to come. But Christianity does not allow everybody to come into heaven, and Hinduism does. So the best is if Christianity would learn from Hinduism that everybody will go to heaven, and Hinduism it learns from Christianity that everybody can go to the temples. That would be a wonderful world.
In Hinduism, karma is key. It's not some God-imposed judgment, but rather the natural consequences of our own actions. For the Buddhist approach to judgment, I go to the Shilai Temple in Los Angeles to meet Venerable Yifa, a Buddhist nun with a PhD from Yale.
Well, in Buddhism, nobody's judge you, and nobody's punish you. So even the Buddha in Buddhism, awakening one, he doesn't make a judgment on you, especially not punish you. And so from Buddhist view, it's your own action is your judgment. The result, the accumulation of your action is your judgment. Of course, it's the karma, is the judgment. So the karma is not just like a physical action, but include your words and the mind, your mental function. It's all your karma. So all this accumulation become what we call the seed, S-E-E-D, seeds of experience, and installed in our consciousness and make who we are. Well, after the death, it's the physical body left on this earth, and what we left is this consciousness, and this consciousness is like a storage room. So you install all this seed of experience. So this consciousness is like a magnet.
A magnet.
Magnet, yeah.
To attract.
To attract. Oh. And so who you will be. Are you going to go up in the heaven or going down there to hell or being a human being again? It's this attraction. It's very natural. And that's where you will be reborn.
So let me see if I understand this. That the accumulation of experiences in our lives create a karmic force that after we die, that force will naturally, like a magnetic attraction, will lead to whatever happens in the next life even.
Exactly. It's a natural process. So frankly, you don't have to become a Buddhist to become a good person.
As for God's judgment, in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, God does the judging, and it occurs after one's bodily death. In Eastern religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, judgment is a natural process based on karma, and it occurs through innumerable cycles of reincarnation. The contrast is stark and to seek artificial harmony is to debase both. In assessing the doctrine, I cannot go further. But I do wonder how God's judgment might literally work. I turn to a scientist believer, Robert John Russell, an ordained minister with a PhD in physics who focuses on ultimate things. Bob is director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley.
The question of heaven and the question of hell are quite different. Heaven seems to be pretty much a promise that you get in Old Testament, New Testament, the Quran. Hell is much more of a kind of construct that developed over the ages, into the Middle Ages, for lots of social political reasons as well as kind of theological ones. Some people say life is purgatory. This is already the process of sanctification and of purging and of repentance. Others will say it spills over, and that there's a sense in which the new creation involves continuing processes of growth.
Well, if we stick on hell for a moment, the traditional Christian understanding it seems to be quite severe.
To imagine that God would punish someone forever for what they've done here seems totally unfair. If that's the case, it can't be true because God is not totally unfair, but God is the source of fairness. We don't see the whole picture. So it isn't as if I go to a different place and I'm punished. It's that I'm given the possibility of transformation, which can be very rugged.
That doesn't cause you to reject much of the Christian tradition about that doctrine?
Well, I think I would reformulate the doctrine. I would say, look, I want to preserve the idea of accountability, of radical accountability. And I want to preserve the idea of the chance to reform, to repent, to change, to grow, right, through forgiveness, a contrite heart. And yet, in my hope for a new creation, can I continue the grace and mercy without the sin and brokenness? The bottom line for me is that I'm accountable. And I myself will suffer, as well as others, from my misactions. And whether that's contained in this life or it spills over into eternity is an open question. And my hope is that if it spills over more into a sense of purgation and growth and true community than into some sort of isolated existence from which there's no return in the eternal suffering. I do not believe that.
And how do you look at a so-called judgment day? Is this something that occurs for everyone just right after they die? Is it something that will be embedded within the flow of history? Is this something only to be reserved for when there is a general transformation of the new heavens and the new earth?
Well, actually, all three, I think. It depends how you spell it out. The underlying question really is continuity. What makes me between the moment I die and the moment of resurrection? And if you say, well, I continue because I have an immortal soul, then that's one tradition. If you say, my death is coterminous with my resurrection or with the new life or the judgment day, then you don't need an immortal soul to get between the two. A lot of the hell tradition was based on the immortal soul, like Dante's Inferno. That's what's there, your soul. But I don't believe we have an immortal soul. I believe you fully die. I think Paul is very clear that you die and you are then resurrected. And so there's no need for an element of continuity, a soul. And therefore, there's nothing to go to hell. But I do think that the moment that I die is, if it's coterminous with the moment that we're all raised together, then the universal judgment or the universal transformation is also an individual transformation. It's one seen from the side of me, one seen from the side of the world.
Well, the one thing about this topic is that one way or another, you and I are both going to find out. And I hope we're there to compare notes.
We will be.
So Bob sure will both be there, along with everyone else. I hope Bob's right, of course, yet the vast assumptions required I cannot imagine. To many moderns, God's judgment seems so remote as to be irrelevant, or so absurd as to be laughable. If one believes in religion, any religion, judgment is core. If you ignore judgment, you reject religion. If God does not exist, God's judgment is nothing but a political trick, a millstone of mass control. If God does exist, and if God is merciful as well as just, God's judgment is ultimate truth, a milestone in a magnificent journey. Millstone or milestone, there's nothing in the middle. God's judgment is either trick or truth. One or the other is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.